So I want to talk this morning, obviously, on the subject of missions, because I want to stir the pot, not because you all are not involved in missions, but I just want to keep encouraging you to do what you've been doing. And the text we're going to go to is in Romans chapter 15. We'll get to there in just a few moments. Romans chapter 15 is the text that we're going to be looking at. Probably most of you have heard of the great missionary called David Livingstone. He got his start in this region of the world. Perhaps you don't know the backstory of it, but there was a man by the name of Robert Moffat who was a missionary in Kurdiman, which is in the northwestern part of South Africa, kind of out in the Karoo. And he had been a missionary there working among the people in that region of this country. And he went back to Scotland and was preaching in a church where David Livingstone happened to attend. And as he preached, Moffat said, "Many a morning I have stood on the porch of my house looking northward and see the smoke arise from the villages that have never heard of Jesus Christ. I've seen at different times the smoke of 1,000 villages whose people are without Christ and without God and without hope in the world. The smoke of 1,000 villages." As you think of his history and as Moffat was preaching that day, that phrase captured David Livingstone's heart. The smoke of 1,000 villages where Christ had never been preached before. Today, if Livingstone was alive, he might have said, "I've seen the light of 1 billion cell phones." But kind of use this illustration to focus our attention today about the fact that there still are thousands, tens of thousands of regions in the world today that have never heard the gospel or at least received missionary attention. And what I want to do is to encourage you to think in terms of what you as a church can do about many of the challenges that exist beyond the borders of South Africa. As a result of that message that Moffat preached, David Livingstone could not sleep. He was wide awake, and he couldn't get away from that phrase, the smoke of 1,000 villages. And as a result, he too came to Africa, joined Moffat, went to Kurdiman, and started working with him. But he became frustrated because there was a bunch of missionaries that were sort of cloistered there in Kurdiman. And he said, "What about all the 1,000 villages out there where the gospel's never been preached before?" And he said, "I'm going to go." And so he launched out and decided that he was going to go to become a missionary to those people. As a result, for 30 years, he traipsed all over Africa. Most of it he walked, and they estimate probably about 50,000 kilometers in his lifetime. My goal in this message is to try to show you that there's still those 10,000 villages that still need the gospel. According to the research that we've done, there are still in Africa 900 unreached people groups. Now that's kind of lingo that we use in the missions world, unreached people groups. What we mean by that is this. It's a language group, a group of people that cluster around a language. They are a people group. And we're saying there's 900 of them where there is not a solid church established in that group. And in spite of all of the work that we have done in Africa over the years, there are still over 900 of those people groups that have not been reached. And those of you that understand your theology, you'll understand that even though there's a lot of churches throughout Africa, many of them are dominated by the prosperity gospel, may or may not even have the gospel, but yet they call themselves Christian. So there is still a lot of work to be done in Africa. We helped 2 years ago to launch an organization called Biblical Ministries South Africa. And that organization is designed to help South African churches to send South Africans around the world. Perhaps your effectiveness is going to be in Africa. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But what I want you to see is the smoke of those thousands of villages. That there are still incredible needs that exist in Africa and around the world today. South Africa, Biblical Ministry South Africa, has gotten off and running. We've already have 10 units or couples that have joined, some of them already on the mission fields, some in the Middle East. I was just up in Tanzania. I think Gideon has been here, right? You guys know Gideon? We were just up there visiting them as they launched a revitalization of a church that had been started a number of years ago, but now have faltered. And so he's going to revitalize that church. But more than revitalize that church, we're looking at using that as a foundation or a base to reach out into Tanzania, into Malawi, and probably the most neglected or least reached country in Africa is the Comores. Maybe some of you have been there on holiday, but that is a place where we've done the least amount of missionary work in all of Africa. And so we're seeking to say, you know what, maybe it's the South African church's roles to see what they can do about this. And so we're excited about what God is doing and how God is raising up South African churches and South African missionaries to meet the needs that exist around the world. You folk are uniquely positioned to reach Africa. Now, when you think of missions, don't just think of Africa. The whole world needs to be an area that you're looking at. But I believe that God can very uniquely use South African churches to reach Africa for a number of reasons. First of all, you guys understand Africa. You've grown up here and you know this culture. You are going to be far more effective in reaching Africans than Americans will be, because it is such a radically different culture from what we're used to. And so you understand Africa. You're already multilingual. You know, most people here can speak several languages. Americans speak one language, and even not that well. And so we struggle to learn a second language, but you know, when you know 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, 6 languages, adding another one's no big deal. And so you guys already are multilingual, and because of that, you're going to be able to learn some of these other languages that are necessary in order to take the gospel to other people. You're also in closer proximity to many of these countries that need to be reached than what we are. And because it's within easy reach, and people travel there on business, and people are traveling there on vacation, and you can get there quite easily, it only makes sense that South African churches focus on trying to reach some of these 900 unreached people groups in the country, on the continent. Another advantage that you have is you guys understand church planting. The church that I attend in the United States has been around for 200 years. They've long forgotten what it was to start a church because they have been established for that long. But many of you are first-generation believers. You're first-generation church plants. You've been here as the church has been planted. You know what it's all about. You've experienced it. You've seen it. You've lived it. And for you to plant churches, you already know what it's all about. And God has equipped you and positioned you right now with that knowledge to expand church planting around this continent. Additionally, you have, as South Africa, the economic clout to make this happen. Maybe some of you say, well, I don't think we're that rich or that we're that well off. But compared to the rest of Africa, this is the largest GDP on the continent here in South Africa. South Africa is the 36th largest economy in the world. And so the money is here. All you got to do is drive down some highways and look at the malls and see the buildings that are going. You have the economic potential to send out missionaries from this country. And so I am so optimistic about what God is going to do in this country as you send out missionaries. You know, every country goes through a cycle in its involvement in missions. You know, one time, the United Kingdom, Scotland, England were kind of the central area for where people were leaving for the mission field. David Livingstone was from Scotland. And they were the ones that were sending missionaries all over the world. Well, they kind of lost interest in missions. And today those countries are a mission field. They need many more churches established there in those places. And the center of gravity moved over to the United States, and the United States sent out tens of thousands of missionaries all over the world. But the sad reality is the United States is starting to lose its interest in missions. And the day will come where the United States is like England is today. But I believe that God can use a country like South Africa to carry the banner of missions and to be one of the bright lights of the world in missions. You folk need to understand the potential that is here and embrace that potential and commit yourselves to being the light of the world and taking the gospel to places where the gospel has not been preached. I want us to go to this passage of scripture in Romans chapter 15, which is biographical. The Apostle Paul is writing about his experience, and he says, I will not venture to speak anything except what Christ has accomplished through me to bring Gentiles to obedience by word and deed and by the power and signs and wonders, by the power of the Spirit of God, so that from Jerusalem all the way around to Illyricum, I have fulfilled the ministry of the gospel of Christ. And thus I make it my ambition to preach the gospel. And here's where I want us to focus this morning. I make it my ambition to preach the gospel, not where Christ has already been named, lest I build on another man's foundation. Notice several things about that statement that the Apostle Paul made. So what he's doing is, he says, I'm a missionary to the Gentiles. I'm going to take the gospel to those that are not in the Jewish nation, because up until this time, frankly, most people were Jewish that were in the church. And they were kind of very insular, and they were thinking about only themselves. But now God brought Paul on board to spread the gospel to Gentiles. And so he said, I want to spread the gospel from Jerusalem to Illyricum, which today is like around Croatia. So that it would include Greece, it would include Turkey, it would include Lebanon, that whole region. He says, I'm going to take the gospel to people that have never heard the gospel before. So he says, my focus in life is to preach the gospel where Christ has not been named. Notice several things here. First of all, he says, this is my ambition. He's not suggesting that everybody ought to do this. He's not suggesting that everybody in Jerusalem or at the Church of Antioch ought to just quit their jobs and go to the mission field. But he says, this is my ambition. I just can't help but wonder if there might be someone here in this room today that would catch that vision like David Livingstone did. And as I try to paint the picture of the needs around Africa and around the world, you would say, you know what? The gospel has been preached in Benoni, but I wonder if there's some places around the world where I could take the gospel where it's never been preached before. Not everybody's going to do that. My father was a missionary in Nigeria, and that's where I grew up. He was one of those pioneering kinds like David Livingstone who went out to the ends of the road and just kept on going because he had seen from an airplane survey all of the villages that were in this northeastern region of that country, and he committed himself to taking the gospel and planting churches in a region where no one had ever gone before. That was him. Now, I came to South Africa to plant churches, and David Livingstone had already beat me to this. The gospel was already here. You have a long legacy of the gospel in this country. And so the gospel has been preached. Was my dad right and me wrong? No, it's just a different calling that God has placed on our two different lives. And so some people God has called to be right here in Benoni and to spread the gospel in Benoni, but perhaps from this congregation, there would be someone or several of you that would say, you know what? Like the Apostle Paul, I'm going to make it my ambition to preach the gospel where the gospel's never been preached before. And so if you have even an inkling towards that, I hope you'll stick with me here for the next few moments as I talk about this topic. But those of you that say, well, that's just not me, you have a role to play in helping to get those kinds of people to the mission field. And so please stay with me here as I talk about this topic for the next few moments. Notice the next thing he says is, it's not only my ambition, but he says the thing that he wanted to do was to preach the gospel. Now, it's kind of a no-brainer, isn't it, to say that missionaries ought to preach the gospel? But unfortunately, there are people that call themselves missionaries that never get around to that. They're doing all kinds of nice things out there. They're doing good things, but they never get around to preaching the gospel. But the heart and soul of what a missionary does is we go to preach the good news that Jesus Christ died on the cross, was buried, and that he rose again and paid the price for our sins. That's the good news that we declare. And basically, there are only two kinds of religions in the world. They may have different names, but there's only two. One is one in which we try to do enough good works to get to heaven. And then there's the faith of Jesus Christ, which says he paid the price. So it basically is this way. All the religions of the world start with man. And they say, what can I do in order to build up enough credits with God so that he'll accept me? That's all the religions of the world. Jesus came along and said, you're never going to build enough credits. You can't be good enough. It's not what you do, but what I have done on the cross. And so salvation is not because of what you can do. Salvation is because of what Christ accomplished on the cross for our salvation. That's the good news that we need to spread all over the world. Why? Because peoples of the world are caught up in their religions saying, I'm going to keep struggling to do the best that I can, and hopefully someday I might make it to heaven or be right with God. We have great news. You don't have to struggle. You don't have to keep working to earn your salvation. God provided it for you. All you got to do is receive it. And that is the message that Paul took from Jerusalem to Illyricum. That's the message that missionaries ought to be taking to the rest of the world. So he says, I made it my ambition to preach the gospel, not where Christ has already been named. Now, there's a model that is given to us by Jesus in the Great Commission in Acts chapter 1, where he said there's different spheres of work that we need to be involved in. First, he says you need to be involved in Jerusalem, then Judea, Samaria, and uttermost part. There's kind of 4 areas. Jerusalem is your own town. You need to be concerned about working here in Benoni. What people need to receive Christ in Benoni, I dare say there's thousands of them. And so you have a mission field right on your doorstep, and you are a missionary to your community as you work together to try to reach them for Christ. Judea was kind of a little bit broader, and so that was kind of maybe the country, and you're supporting missionaries in different parts of this country as they're planting churches. Samaritans were people that were from a different culture and that had moved in, and so there's a ministry that we need to have towards other cultures. And so where we live and work in the United States, right next to our church building, they're building a mosque. And the Muslims are moving into that region of our city. Those are Samaritans. That is another culture that we're not used to, but we are seeking to do what we can to try to reach those Muslims with the message of Jesus Christ. They've come into our world. But then the uttermost parts of the world is when we start thinking beyond our borders of our country. What about the rest of Africa? What about the rest of the world? We need to be thinking about what we can do to reach all 4 of those areas. It's not enough to just concentrate on one. We need to do all 4. So Paul had a very specific goal. He said from Jerusalem to Illyricum. You as a church, I'm encouraging you to think about some very specific goals outside of the boundaries of South Africa. What is it that this church could do to impact the rest of Africa, the rest of the world? You know, there's a missionary that's working up in Eastern Europe that I've heard speak several times, and one of the things that captured my attention that he said was this. He said, in America, we try to start the coolest church in town. On the mission field, we try to start the only church in town. And that ought to be our aspiration, that we ought to be going to places where there is no church, and we want to start the only church in town. Paul said, I want to preach the gospel where it's never been preached before. And he says, I don't want to build on someone else's foundation. He wanted to go in where nobody had ever gone before and start from scratch. And there may be some of you here this morning that are that kind of person. You're the kind of David Livingston kind of person that says, I don't want to stay here on the mission station. I want to get out. Some of you might say, this is my calling. I belong here at Benoni, and I'm going to be part of this church, and I'm going to help evangelize our Jerusalem. But I can't help but wonder if there might be some here in this room this morning that are kind of David Livingston-ish, or maybe the Apostle Paul-ish, that would say, I want to go preach the gospel where the gospel's never been preached before. You know how fun that is? You know, sometimes I get tired of being in America because you preach a sermon and everybody's heard 50 sermons on that same passage over and over again. And it's kind of ho-hum. But you know, you preach to people that have never heard the gospel before. What a joy to be able to be the first person to explain to them the gospel, to teach them about Jesus, to train them in the Bible. It's just a thrill. And some of you may catch that vision. Some of you may say, that's what I want to do with my life. I want to keep that, encouraging you to think that way. Notice the next verse. Paul says, as it is written. Now, when you get to a phrase like that in the New Testament, normally it's referring to the Old Testament because they're quoting from what's already been written. And Paul is doing that. He said this idea of taking the gospel to places that they've never heard before is not a new idea. As it is written, he's quoting from Isaiah, those who have never been told of him will see, and those who have never heard will understand. So Paul wasn't just coming up with a harebrained idea. This was something that was entrenched in the Old Testament. In fact, sometimes we tend to think that mission started with Acts. It didn't. Mission started way back with the nation of Israel. And God called out the nation of Israel to be a light to the nations. He very clearly stated that to them. And they oftentimes forgot that, and oftentimes became self-centered and self-focused, and they forgot that the reason for their existence was missions. Now, the approach was a little bit different back in those days. God told them to build the temple in Jerusalem so that the nations could come to Jerusalem to learn about God. When Jesus came, he reversed that process. He says it's no longer come, but go. So we're not expecting people to come to Benoni to hear the gospel. We have to go to where people are. And so we're looking for people that will say, I want to go take the gospel to people that will never come to Benoni, but they need to hear the gospel. And so Paul quotes from Isaiah a clear command that the gospel is to be taken to every person on the planet, and that is our role today. I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and we're not really known for much other than having a big airport, and that's convenient. But one of the things that we're famous for is that's where Coca-Cola was invented. And so Coca-Cola, and the main headquarters for Coca-Cola worldwide is located in our city. And Coca-Cola, the president of Coca-Cola a number of years ago, cast a vision for his company, and he said, we want everyone on planet Earth to taste a Coke. You know what? They've almost succeeded. Every place I go around the world, there's Coke. You could be floating down the river on the Amazon and a Coke can will come floating by. You seen the movie that comes from here, Gods Must Be Crazy? You know, the Coke bottle? Believe it or not, we were driving through Namibia a few years ago. And we stopped beside the side of the road in the middle of the desert, and there's a Coke bottle. It's there, out in the middle of nowhere. Coca-Cola has succeeded in getting the sugar water out to everybody around the world. But the thing that upsets me is they've done it and we haven't. They've gotten Coke out to the world, and we still have hundreds, thousands of unreached people groups that have never tasted the living water. We've got something far better than Coca-Cola. And that is the living water of Jesus Christ, the salvation that comes through his death, burial, and resurrection. That is what we want to take to the world. But we have not finished our job yet. That's why Biblical Ministries Worldwide South Africa. That's why your pastor is committed to this organization and is working hard to try to expand missions in this country. Because we have potential in this country, I believe, that is incredible if we will commit ourselves to it. And we can be part of getting the living water to the rest of the world. Well, now, when, when you talk about, are there places where the gospel has never been preached before? That's a hard one to answer today. I'm going to give you kind of an answer, but it's a hard one to be definitive about because of the internet. It's amazing that no matter where you go in the world, they have a cell phone. You can be out in a remote village in India, and if they Indonesia rather, and if they climb the right tree on the right mountain, they can get a signal, and they're connected with the rest of the world. It's just amazing what has happened. And so chances are people all over the world have, if they happen to have gotten on the right website, have gotten the gospel. So we don't know for sure where the gospel has not been preached at all, but we do know where the dark spots are. We do know there are places where the gospel has not been preached on a regular basis and churches established. There are a number of organizations such as these. You might want to just rattle around on them and bounce around on them, take a look. So these, like the Joshua Project, let's go back to, stay right there for just a second. The Joshua Project does a lot of research around the world to say where have missionaries gone and where have they not gone. And they're the ones that have identified 900 unreached people groups on the continent of Africa. And you can find all kinds of statistics like that. Now you need to sort of read that and read it through this lens that they all have a definition of what Christian is. Some define Christian much broader in that if you're not a Muslim, you're a Christian. So you've got to sort of sift through and understand that it's not definitive, but it will give you kind of a general idea of where the needs are around the world. And so these are useful tools that we have today. You say, where are the most of the unreached people groups? Let's take a look at the next slide here. Sort of that purple-looking stripe across there, you can't see the detail of it, but that's where the majority of the unreached people groups of the world are today. There are unreached people groups scattered all over the place. We have one in our city, in Atlanta. They're Pakistani Muslims. So they're all over the place. But the majority of them are in that region. As you can see, a large chunk of them are on your continent. Now, those are more difficult places to get into. There's no question about that. But I just told you, there are missionaries in Korea, and if there can be missionaries in Korea, there can be missionaries in any of these countries. Someone has said, there's no such thing as a closed country if you don't care if you never come back. We can get in. We may not get back, but we can get in. But we need some people with a sense of reckless abandon that will say, I'm going to go for the cause of Christ and try to reach some people that are unreached. Let's take a look at another slide. Again, this is just very broad brush, general, but there's about 7,000 languages in the world today. A third of them, we've translated the Bible into their language. About a third of them, we're working on it. But a third of them, nobody's doing anything. Somebody needs to do Bible translation still around the world because people can't read the Bible unless it's in their language. And perhaps God has gifted you in the area of linguistics, and languages come easy for you. Maybe God gave you that gift because he wants you to commit your life to help bring the Bible to an unreached people around the world. I'm just trying to encourage you to try to think in terms of what God may do to use you to take the gospel where the gospel has never been preached before. Is there an Apostle Paul here? You may never raise to his stature. You won't be an apostle as the way he was. But a person that would say, it is my ambition to preach the gospel where the gospel has never been preached before. I don't want to lay on someone else's foundation. I want to build from scratch. If we had an unlimited supply of groceries, Would it make more sense to stand outside of Spur where everybody's coming out and just had a meal, or go to some place where there is no restaurant? Well, we say, no, if we've got groceries to give away, let's take them to where the need is. We need to be thinking that way in the spiritual world. Where I live in Atlanta, Georgia, we live like, it takes me maybe 2 minutes to get to our church building. But in that 2 minutes, probably less than 2 minutes, I pass 2 other churches to go to the church that I want to go to. I feel guilty when I do that. When I realize that there are thousands of people today that have no choice as to any church. At least here you have a choice of churches, and you've come to Benoni Bible Church because you found something here that resonates with you and that you're comfortable with and that you like and that's part of your core values. But just think of the peoples around the world that have no choice. They can't say, well, I don't like that church, so I'm going to go to this church. They have no church to choose from. And part of our responsibility as the Church of Jesus Christ is to do something about that. Well, David Livingstone arrived in Cape Town, took the about 1,500 kilometer trek up to Kuruman. And as I mentioned earlier, he sort of got fed up with the fact that there were so many missionaries clustered in one place. He wanted to go into the deeper regions of Africa, and he tried to talk his wife into it, and she says, I just can't do that. She went back to Scotland. He didn't see her for another 5 years. He went up into Africa, traipsed around. Finally, he got back to Scotland after 5 years. And I'm reading from part of a biography. 5 years later, when he set his eyes on his wife, she could not recognize him. Because at one stage in his travels, going to preach, he had walked into a branch of a tree that completely blinded him in one eye and marred the other. His face was burned from the African sun to a crisp of leather, and his skin, which had not been pigmented for it, was roasted to the point that his body could not take it any longer. His face marred and scarred, his eyes blinded, and at one time he had been attacked by a lion and had seen one of his shoulders torn apart. He had miraculously escaped. So he went back and spent some time back in Scotland, but he couldn't get away from the idea that he had seen these thousands of villages out there that had never heard the gospel before. He finally went back one day. Again, his wife says, I just don't think that I could bear the rigors of what it takes to travel through Africa. And so he took off for Africa again. A few years later, she came to Cape Town. She went and to try to find him. But after only being here a few weeks, she got a disease and she died. And the sorrow that was brought upon his life because of the sacrifice that he was willing to make. This biographer says that out of 17 years of married life, they only spent 4 of those years together because Livingstone was out traveling, trying to push into the inner parts of Africa. Livingstone is kind of a controversial person, but he was a pioneer, and oftentimes pioneers are controversial. I'm not suggesting that you leave your wife and your family and go to the mission field. It's possible to take them with you these days, much more so than it was back in David Livingstone's day. But at the age of 59, he penned these words that have been turned into a song. You may have sung this song here, I don't know. But the words of the song are, Lord, send me anywhere, only go with me. Lay any burden on me, only sustain me. Sever any ties save the tie that binds me to thy heart. My Jesus, my King, my life, my all, I dedicate my whole self to you. A year later, after penning those words, he died in a hut in Central Africa. But he committed himself to saying, I'm going to do what I can to take the gospel where the gospel has never been preached. There's a light of 1,000 village fires, so to speak, around the world where the gospel has not been declared. And I just can't help but believe that this church will be instrumental in snuffing some of and bringing the light to some of those places where the gospel is not and where there is no light. And so my encouragement to you today is, in spite of all you've done in missions in the past, and I realize you've got a big missions budget and you're committed to missions, build on that and expand your vision for what God can do through this church. And our job as a mission agency is to walk alongside of you and to assist your missionaries in the whole process of preparing to go and getting there, providing the support systems, both financially as well as other training that needs to take place. And so we want to encourage that, and that's our desire. But it's going to take someone here in this church that says, I have the same vision that the Apostle Paul had. I have the same vision that David Livingstone had. I want to take the gospel where the gospel has never been preached before. Father, I pray that you would indeed raise up from this congregation not just one, but a constant stream of people that will head out to the mission fields of the world. I pray, Lord, that you would build on the vision that this church already has for taking the gospel around the world, and that, Lord, this church would become an incredible example to other churches in South Africa as to what could be accomplished. And so, Lord, I commit this congregation to you and ask that you would use them in a very specific way in the days ahead to launch missionaries. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.